Choosing a career in law enforcement is both rewarding and challenging. Law enforcement officers respond to all citizens to keep their communities safe and protect them from harm. An officer's duties are often performed with tremendous cost. The average officer is exposed to more trauma and human suffering in the first 3 years on the job than most civilians will see in their lifetime. This exposure, coupled with other stressors, can lead some officers to contemplate or attempt suicide. Many suicidal acts are impulsive, and constant access to firearms puts law enforcement officers at greater risk.
It's the beginning officer. It's the officer that's got 5 or 10 years on the job, and it's the officer that is getting ready for retirement. When it comes to this type of problem, no one's immune.
Remember that law enforcement serves and protects the public and each other. We need you, members of law enforcement, to support each other. Within law enforcement, we need to talk about suicide and what we can do to prevent it. If you suspect that a colleague is becoming overwhelmed by the stresses in his or her life, or if you feel like the stresses in your life are beginning to overwhelm you, talk about it.
In this video, we'll hear from an officer who felt deep despair and contemplated suicide. We'll learn about how you can save yourself and your fellow officers. We'll also hear from an officer and a widow whose colleague and spouse took their own lives. They will talk about the trauma that suicide inflicts on partners and loved ones at work and at home.
My career was making a lot of arrests with organized crime figures and with big-time drug dealers, and doing what a good cop is supposed to do. Saving people, helping people, going into a burning building, anything to deal with children, accident victims, victims of domestic violence. I really felt that I helped these people out tremendously. And then I go home. 3 things that caused me to do what I almost did was marital discord, substance abuse, and a departmental problem.
In addition to those 3 warning signs, depression, an attitude of hopelessness and helplessness, and changes in behavior, such as an increase in the use of alcohol or having difficulties at work or at home, are also warning signs.
Every suicide impacts 8 people, and I am one of those 8 people. My husband was a police officer, and he committed suicide. I feel now that if Ed could be driven to complete the act of suicide, it could happen to anybody. Anybody, because if you were to make a list of people least likely to commit suicide, he would be number 1 on that list. He was an exceptional husband, he was an exceptional father, and he was an exceptional police officer because he always went above and beyond what was expected of him and what was required of him. Ed became a police officer quite simply to serve and protect. It was something that he had always wanted to do. He made his way through ranks of sergeant, lieutenant, captain. I think he was sworn in November. So 6 months later is when he committed suicide. The beginning of the end was probably in 1993 when he was hit by a train. He was going to the pistol range to requalify, and no one knew these tracks were operational. That accident, for some reason, really triggered something in him. I think most people would have retired after that because he could have been out on disability. But he loved being a police officer so much, he went back to it. If something was disturbing, he'd talk about it, which is why I always thought he would be okay. There had been other police officers in Jersey City that committed suicide. He talked about why these people might have taken their lives and said it was something he would never consider doing.
You're suffering yourself, and you're suffering inside. And then all of a sudden it gets to a point where you say to yourself, something's wrong, and something's happening to me. And you can't really define it. You can't really explain it, but it just manifests inside you. You think that the only thing in your life is to end it, is to put an end to the suffering that you're going through. You just feel like that's the only way out. Temporary problem, permanent solution.
Many law enforcement officers think that asking for help is a sign of weakness, but it's not. You have to be a strong person to understand that you need help and to ask for it. You have to be a strong person to approach a colleague and ask if that person needs help.
One horrific moment is all it takes. And being a police officer, having firearms around, it made it easy. Ed drove into Pennsylvania and checked into a hotel there. But he used 2 guns. One gunshot wound to the head and one to the heart. And again, for the life of me, I couldn't understand why 2 guns. And nobody could give me the answer. And then I finally arrived at it myself. He wanted to make sure he got the job done. I think because police have such easy access to their weapons that every little sign has to be recognized. We can't ignore it. Someone going from being verbal to kind of nonverbal. Someone from working at their job suddenly retiring. Someone who sleepless starts sleeping a lot, or vice versa. With this, you have no closure. So I come up with my answers that I could live with for a time, and then something else will pop into my head, and I'll say, wait, I have to rethink this. Maybe it was this. Maybe it was that. And that's kind of the life I have ahead of me. This is what I will always be doing. Suicide is not something you get over as a survivor. It's something you learn to live with, and you wake up every morning, and that's the first thing on your mind. You go to sleep, it's the first thing on your mind, and you can't even escape this in your dreams.
We've just heard how the decision to complete suicide can have a devastating impact on those we love. Why are officers at risk? Earlier in this video, we heard about some of the warning signs. We also need to focus on some of the risk factors, including knowledge of and access to lethal means. The majority of officer suicides are completed with the officer's duty weapon. Immediate access to a deadly weapon places officers at greater risk when compared to the civilian population. Demographics. The most frequent victim of law enforcement suicide is a white male, 35 years old, with 12 to 15 years on the job, who has experienced a recent loss. Previous history involving oneself or one's family. Cumulative stressors. Oftentimes, it is the perfect storm that puts an officer into a dangerous situation. Feelings of helplessness or hopelessness. What we have to remember is that these feelings are often temporary. With the appropriate help, an officer, like anyone else, can resolve these issues and feel better.